Kelly Cochran. In the fall of 2014, a woman in Michigan's Upper Peninsula met a co-worker at her factory job and began an affair. Within weeks, that co-worker was dead. 16 months later, her own husband was dead too. She told authorities the two deaths had nothing to do with each other. But when investigators started pulling on the threads, what they found was almost impossible to believe. A marriage built on a pact, two bodies, and a woman who claimed she had done far more than anyone realized. Christopher Reagan was an Air Force veteran and a Detroit native who had moved north to Iron River, Michigan, for work at the Oldenburg Group factory. He was in his mid-50s, about 20 years older than the woman he had started seeing. Co-workers described him as friendly and steady. He had no idea that the woman he was quietly falling for was married to a man who knew everything. Kelly and Jason Cochran had known each other since they were kids growing up in Hobart, Indiana. They married in 2002 and relocated to Caspian, Michigan in 2013 for the factory job Kelly had been offered. Money was tight. Jason lived with chronic back pain from years of servicing swimming pools, and the couple carried debt. There were no children in the home, only two dogs. When Kelly took her position at Oldenburg, she met Christopher Reagan, and their affair began almost immediately. On the 14th of October, 2014, Kelly invited Christopher to the Cochran home. According to prosecutors, Jason was waiting. Jason shot Christopher with a .22 caliber rifle inside the house. The couple then dismembered the body in the basement and scattered the remains in the woods along Pentoga Trail. Christopher was reported missing days later after he failed to show up for work at the factory. Investigators had no body, no witnesses, and no clear motive. His disappearance sat unsolved for more than a year. Then, on the 20th of February, 2016, Jason Cochran was found dead in the couple's Hobart, Indiana home. On paper, it looked like an accidental heroin overdose. Kelly would later admit she had given him the lethal dose and then suffocated him. Her stated reason was simple. She said she had done it to even the score for what he had done to Christopher. Jason's sudden death drew immediate attention back to the still open Reagan disappearance. Iron River Police Chief Laura Frizzo, working alongside Indiana Detective Jeremy Ogden, began pulling every thread they could find. Frizzo had been quietly building the Reagan case for more than a year, and Jason's death gave her the leverage she needed to push Kelly into interviews. Kelly, for her part, had already fled south to Kentucky, where she was tracked down and taken into custody by the U.S. Marshals. In the woods off Pentoga Trail, searchers eventually recovered only a single skull with a bullet hole in it. Dental records confirmed it belonged to Christopher Reagan. During a long series of interviews, Kelly gave shifting statements. She spoke of a pact she and Jason had made on their wedding night, that if either of them ever cheated, the other partner had the right to end the affair for good. She also implied that she had killed other people over the years and referenced what she called a trinket bag of trophies. The court later noted those references were more consistent with someone playing games with authorities than a genuine confession to other crimes, and no other victims were ever charged in the case. How does a jury weigh the testimony of a woman who seems to enjoy the attention? In 2017, a Michigan jury did not hesitate. Kelly Cochran was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Christopher Reagan, along with larceny, conspiracy to mutilate a dead body, concealing a death, and lying to police. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The following year, she was extradited to Indiana, where she pleaded guilty to the murder of Jason Cochran and received an additional 65 years to run consecutively to her Michigan sentence. During her time in county custody, corrections officers reported that she had fashioned makeshift shanks out of her own eyeglasses. Later, from state prison, she gave a jailhouse interview to ABC's 2020 for a special the network titled Where Monsters Hide, during which she gave what many viewers described as an unsettlingly matter-of-fact account of her role in both deaths. The Michigan Court of Appeals eventually affirmed her first-degree murder conviction, closing off her most direct route back into court. And the Regan family issued a statement thanking investigators for years of persistence on a case that had once looked unsolvable. As of 2026, Kelly Cochran remains incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan, under her combined Michigan and Indiana sentences. She is not expected to ever be released. Cochran's own statements did much of the work of convicting her. The next case turned on a wife who tried to talk her way past not one death, but two. Miriam Helmick. In June of 2008, a woman in western Colorado called for help and reported that her husband had been shot during a home invasion. She said she had come home from running errands to find him on the kitchen floor. But when investigators looked at the scene, the details did not add up. There was no clear sign of forced entry. Thousands of dollars were missing from her husband's accounts. And her first husband, years earlier, had also died of a gunshot wound to the head in circumstances that felt strangely familiar. Alan Helmick was a prominent businessman in Mesa County, Colorado, and a widower. His first wife, Sharon, had died of a heart attack in 2003. He met Miriam in the years that followed and married her, believing he had found companionship for the second half of his life. He lived quietly in Whitewater, a small community outside Grand Junction. Miriam was a former dance instructor and had been married before. Her first husband was a man named Jack Calloway Giles, and they had lived together in Jacksonville, Florida. Giles died in 2002 of a gunshot wound to the head, ruled at the time as self-inflicted. Miriam had been the beneficiary of his $100,000 life insurance policy. Investigators would later note something that had escaped attention in the original ruling. Giles was strongly left-handed, but the shot had entered the right side of his head. On the 10th of June, 2008, Alan Helmick was shot in the back of the head in the kitchen of his Whitewater home. He was 64 years old. Miriam called authorities and reported a burglary. But as detectives began investigating, they discovered something startling. Roughly 40 days before the shooting, Miriam had allegedly attempted to kill Alan by placing a wick-like device inside the gas tank of his car in the town of Delta and lighting it. The device failed to ignite the fuel the way she had planned, and Alan survived without ever knowing what had actually happened. Prosecutors also discovered that Miriam had been forging checks from Alan's accounts, siphoning thousands of dollars while working to isolate him from his adult children and extended family. The forgeries drew immediate suspicion. Alan's adult children from his first marriage had been quietly raising concerns about Miriam's behavior for months before the shooting. And once the financial trail came to light, investigators began treating her as a person of interest rather than a grieving widow. When Miriam realized she was being watched, she fled Colorado and returned to Jacksonville, Florida, where she moved in with her son from her first marriage. That son would eventually become one of the key witnesses against her at trial. In Jacksonville, she attempted to pass herself off under the name Sharon Helmick, using Alan's late first wife's identity as a cover while she tried to sell off assets and access accounts she no longer had legal authority over. Investigators also revisited the death of Jack Giles. They could not conclusively prove foul play in that case, and no charges were ever filed related to his death. But the pattern was undeniable. Two husbands, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, 2 life insurance beneficiaries, and both times, that beneficiary was Miriam. How many coincidences does it take before a pattern becomes a case? In 2009, a Mesa County jury convicted Miriam Helmick of first-degree murder for the killing of Allen, attempted first-degree murder for the earlier attempt on his car, and 10 counts of forgery. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus consecutive terms for the forgery counts. Before the trial had begun, the presiding judge, Valerie Robeson, made a critical decision. She excluded the death of Jack Giles from evidence, finding that prosecutors had not shown by a preponderance of the evidence that Giles had been murdered. The jury would decide the case against Miriam based only on what she had done to Allen, without ever hearing the parallel story from Florida. Prosecutors argued that even without the Giles history, the physical evidence, the forgery trail, and the earlier car fire were more than enough to establish premeditation, and the jury agreed. Miriam's direct appeal was affirmed, and multiple post-conviction attempts were denied in the years that followed, including a Colorado Court of Appeals denial reported in April of 2024. In January of 2025, she spoke publicly for the first time on an episode of ABC's 2020. Reporters had once asked her whether she had loved her husband. Her answer, that she had loved him to death, became one of the most quoted lines of the entire case. As of 2026, Miriam Helmick is roughly 67 years old and continues to serve her sentence in a Colorado correctional facility. There is no realistic path by which she leaves prison alive. Where Helmick tried to run, the next wife stayed in place and let another man pull the trigger for her. Chasey Pointer. On the evening of the 9th of September, 2016, a woman in Texas called for help from a remote stretch of country road. She told dispatchers her Jeep was stuck in mud and that her husband, who had driven out to help her, had just been shot by a stranger stepping out of the shadows. Her husband was Robert Pointer, a captain in the University Park Fire Department. But the story Chasey Pointer told police that night held together only as long as it took investigators to start reading her text messages. Robert Louis Pointer III was a captain with the University Park Fire Department in the Dallas area. He was 18 years older than his wife, and he had 3 daughters from his marriage and previous relationships. Colleagues at the fire department described him as steady and dependable. He had already begun taking steps to end his marriage. Chasey Tyler Pointer had met Robert around 2007 and married him in 2009. They lived in Roy's City, Texas, and had one shared young daughter. What Robert did not know was that Chasey had been carrying on multiple affairs throughout the marriage. One of those affairs was with a man named Michael Glenn Garza. Prosecutor Calvin Grogan would later focus the jury's attention on 2 documents in particular. The first was the prenuptial agreement Chasey had signed before the wedding, which limited what she stood to gain in a divorce. The second was a life insurance policy on Robert Pointer's life, worth $685,000, on which Chasey was the primary beneficiary. In a divorce, she stood to lose almost everything. If Robert died first, she stood to gain a fortune. On the evening of the shooting, Chasey lured Robert to an isolated area near Farm to Market Road 35 and Hunt County Road 2595 in Hunt County. She claimed her vehicle was stuck in the mud and asked him to come help her get it free. When Robert arrived, Michael Garza was already waiting nearby. Garza shot Robert in the head with a shotgun. The weapon was registered to Garza's brother, Matthew. When police arrived on scene, Chasey told them a shadowy figure had emerged from the darkness and fired at her husband. She said she had no idea who the man was or why he had done it. Officers were skeptical from the moment their body cameras started recording. Her demeanor at the scene, her inconsistent recollections, and her composure in the presence of her husband's body all raised immediate flags. Some of the earliest inconsistencies were captured on video and would later be played back for jurors. Under further questioning at the station, Chasey eventually admitted she had known the shooter was Michael Garza, though she continued to insist she had not known he would use the shotgun that night. Detectives then obtained her phone. What they found were text messages between Chasey and Garza, and between Chasey and other men she had been involved with, in which she made her feelings about her husband unmistakably clear. She wanted Robert gone. Combined with the life insurance policy, the prenuptial agreement that would have hobbled her in a divorce, and the timing of Robert's contact with a divorce attorney the day before, prosecutors built a case for capital murder under Texas law, killing another person for financial remuneration. When Texas prosecutors put capital murder on the table, why would any jury choose anything less? Chasey Pointer was indicted for murder, and the charge was later upgraded to capital murder. Her trial took place in June of 2019 in Greenville's 354th District Court. After roughly 4 hours of deliberation, the jury declined the capital murder charge and instead convicted her of the lesser-included offense of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, meaning a minimum of 30 years must pass before she becomes eligible for parole. During the trial, a statement she had given in a 48 hours interview that Robert was not supposed to die was played back for jurors and became one of the most discussed moments of the proceedings. Members of Robert Pointer's family gave impact statements describing a man who had already made peace with the end of his marriage and had been focused on a future with his daughters. Michael Garza had already been convicted of the shooting in July of 2018 and sentenced to 99 years in a Texas prison. In 2021, the Fifth Court of Appeals in Dallas upheld Chasey's conviction, finding no reversible error. Garza's conviction had already been affirmed in July of 2020. As of 2026, Chasey Pointer continues to serve her sentence at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Her earliest possible parole date sits decades away, and members of Robert Pointer's family have made clear they intend to attend any future parole hearing to oppose her release. Pointer's plan depended on a lover to carry out the killing. The next case belonged to a wife who was in the room herself, alongside a cousin. Rita Glusman. Before she was ever called the Jewish Lizzie Borden, Rita Glusman was celebrated as a hero. In the 1970s, she staged a hunger strike, met with future President George H.W. Bush, and pressured the Soviet Union into letting her husband, a Jewish scientist, emigrate. Yakov Glusman went on to become a senior cancer researcher in New York. But in April of 1996, his dismembered body would be pulled from a river in New Jersey. And Rita, the woman who had once fought the Kremlin to save him, would be charged with taking his life. Yakov Glusman was a molecular biologist and a senior researcher at Laderley Laboratories in Pearl River, New York. He was 48 years old at the time of his death. In December of 1995, he had filed for divorce and had begun seeing another woman. He had also moved out of the family home into a nearby apartment. Rita Glusman had been born in Soviet Ukraine in 1948. Her public fight to bring Yakov to the West had made international news at the time, and it had cemented her reputation as a fighter and a public figure inside the Refusenik movement. Once in the United States, she held a stake in a computer firm called ECI Technologies, which employed her cousin, Vladimir Zelenin. The couple had one adult son named Elon. Prosecutors would later say her motive in the spring of 1996 was straightforward. Yakov's divorce filing meant she stood to lose a great deal, financially and reputationally. And after everything she had done to bring him to the West, she was unwilling to accept it. On the 6th of April, 1996. Rita and Vladimir Zelenin ambushed Yakov inside his Pearl River apartment. Using axes and a hammer, they killed him. They then dismembered his body with a scalpel and hacksaws. Their intention, according to investigators, had been to distribute the remains in bags across a wide area, making identification and prosecution nearly impossible. The plan depended on nothing going wrong at the disposal stage. Something did. Later the same day, in East Rutherford, New Jersey, police officer on routine patrol noticed a suspicious van parked near the Passaic River. When he approached, he found Vladimir Zelenin in the act of dumping bags containing pieces of Yakov's body into the water. Zelenin was arrested on the spot. Within hours, he had confessed and had named Rita as the person who had planned the entire attack, explaining that she had recruited him because of family loyalty and the leverage of his employment at her company. Rita, meanwhile, had already fled her home. She was caught 11 days later, hiding in a cabin at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island. Investigators found her in possession of a passport and materials for overseas travel, indicating she had intended to leave the country as soon as she felt it was safe to move. How does the federal government prosecute a woman who has crossed state lines to end her husband's life? In January of 1997, in federal court in White Plains, New York, Rita Glusman became the first woman ever convicted under the Violence Against Women Act. The specific charge was interstate domestic violence resulting in death, and her prosecution set a legal precedent that is still cited in similar federal cases today. In May of that year, she was sentenced to life in federal prison. Vladimir Zelenin pleaded guilty separately and received 22.5 years for his role in the killing. Over the next 2 decades, Rita sought compassionate release repeatedly, arguing changes in her health and her age. Those requests were denied. But in the summer of 2020, her circumstances changed. U.S. District Judge Louis J. Lyman granted her motion for compassionate release after evidence was presented that she had suffered multiple strokes and had been diagnosed with early Parkinson's disease. The judge concluded that her deteriorating condition, combined with the length of time she had already served, met the standards for release. On the 28th of July, 2020, Rita Glusman walked out of the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, Fort Worth, Texas, after 23 years behind bars. As of 2026, Rita Glusman is roughly 78 years old and lives in Hackensack, New Jersey. She was placed on 5 years of supervised release with GPS monitoring and strict restrictions on contact with certain family members. The terms were designed to keep her under close federal oversight even outside prison walls. Of the wives on this list, she is the only one no longer incarcerated, and her release remains a subject of ongoing debate among legal commentators and among members of the Glusman family, who have expressed conflicting views on whether justice was served. Where Glusman's crime was hands-on and violent, the wife in this next case was accused of something colder. According to prosecutors, she had committed her thinking to paper years before the crime. Nancy Crampton Brophy. In 2011, a self-published romance novelist named Nancy Crampton Brophy wrote an essay for her personal blog. She titled it, "How to Murder Your Husband." In it, she reflected on why a wife might consider ending her husband's life and what mistakes she should avoid. 7 years later, her own husband, a beloved Portland chef named Daniel Brophy, was found shot to death in the kitchen where he taught. But investigators would spend the next 4 years trying to prove that the essay had not been fiction after all. Daniel Brophy was a chef and a longtime instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute in Portland. He was 63 years old. He was known for his patience with students and for arriving at the institute early every morning to prep the kitchen for class. On the morning of the 2nd of June, 2018, his own students would be the ones to find him on the floor. Nancy Crampton Brophy had built a modest career self-publishing romance novels, many with titles centered on wronged wives and dangerous men. She and Daniel had been married for years and lived together in the Portland area. Prosecutors alleged that the marriage had run into serious financial trouble in the months leading up to his death, and that a life insurance payout offered Nancy a way out. The defense argued the opposite, saying that Nancy and Daniel had already resolved their money problems by cashing out retirement savings and were not in the crisis prosecutors described. What is not disputed is that Daniel carried a substantial life insurance policy, and Nancy was the beneficiary. On that morning in June, Daniel Brophy arrived at the Oregon Culinary Institute at his usual early hour. Sometime shortly after he began setting up the kitchen, he was shot twice, once in the heart and once in the chest. Students entering the room roughly 20 minutes later found his body. When police arrived, there was no immediate suspect, no clear eyewitness, and no murder weapon left at the scene. Detectives began the slow process of assembling a timeline. Surveillance footage from streets and businesses near the Culinary Institute captured a vehicle matching Nancy's minivan in the area at the approximate time of the shooting. When investigators dug into Nancy's recent purchases, they found something unusual. She had bought a ghost gun kit online, the kind that allows a buyer to assemble an unregistered firearm from parts. She had also legally purchased a Glock 17 at a gun show shortly before the killing. Prosecutors would later allege that she had swapped the barrel and the slide from the ghost gun onto the legally purchased weapon, used it to kill her husband, and then discarded the switched parts, leaving her with a legal gun that no ballistics test could match to the crime. The murder weapon itself was never recovered, despite extensive searches of the surrounding area. Investigators also examined Nancy's writing and her public online presence, including her author biography and social media posts, looking for anything that might illuminate her state of mind. And then, hanging over the entire investigation, was the essay. The now infamous blog post, How to Murder Your Husband, published under her own name and still hosted on her own site at the time detectives began their work. Can an essay written 7 years before a crime be treated as evidence of that crime? The trial judge ruled that the essay itself was inadmissible in the case in chief. Prosecutors would have to make their case on the physical evidence, the surveillance footage, the timeline, and the financial motive. On the 25th of May, 2022, after roughly 8 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a Multnomah County jury convicted Nancy Crampton Brophy of second-degree murder. On the 13th of June, 2022, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Daniel's son from a previous marriage, Nathaniel Stillwater, called her a monster during his impact statement to the court. In February of 2024, her legal team, led by appellate attorney Ryan O'Connor, filed a formal appeal brief with the Oregon Court of Appeals. Among the arguments raised was that the trial court had wrongly allowed cross-examination that referenced the essay, effectively putting the writing in front of jurors through a side door, even though it had been excluded from direct evidence. As of the most recent available reporting, that appeal remains pending. As of 2026, Nancy Crampton Brophy is roughly 75 years old and continues to serve her sentence in an Oregon correctional facility. The earliest date on which she could become eligible for parole falls at roughly a century of age, meaning her sentence is likely to be served in full. The case continues to be studied in journalism programs and criminal law classes for its unusual intersection of a defendant's own writing and the evidence used against her. And Daniel Brophy's former students and colleagues have continued to speak publicly about the impact of his loss on the Portland culinary community. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Emma Rain. For years, a woman in New Orleans went through husbands. Her first was paralyzed in a car accident and later died after his feeding tube was mysteriously removed. Her second, a clergyman, was shot to death in what looked like a home invasion. Her third was found shot dead in rural Mississippi. Each time, she collected on insurance. Each time, she moved on. But it took nearly a decade before an investigator in New Orleans pulled the loose thread that would tie her, at least officially, to one of those deaths. Ernest Smith was a clergyman in New Orleans East. He was married to Emma at the time of his death, though the marriage was Emma's second, and his life insurance policy had recently been increased in a striking way. He was well known in his community. In the spring of 2006, he became the second husband Emma had outlived. Emma Jean Rain, formerly known as Evans and later as Smith, had been married 4 times over the course of her adult life. To those outside her personal circle, she was simply a wife who kept experiencing terrible luck. To investigators who would later look back at her marriages as a group, the pattern was unmistakable. In each case, she had access to significant life insurance benefits. And in each case, the husband did not live long enough to change the beneficiary designation. On the 15th of April, 2006, Ernest Smith was shot to death in the New Orleans area. Prosecutors would later present evidence that Emma and her then lover, a man named James Rain, had arranged the killing to collect on Ernest's life insurance. In the months before his death, Emma had raised that policy from roughly $100,000 to approximately $800,000. The initial investigation treated the case as a possible robbery gone wrong. The killing went unsolved. Meanwhile, Emma continued to move through relationships. She married James Rain, the man she had been seeing at the time of Ernest's death. 5 years later, in 2011, James was found shot dead in Poplarville in Pearl River County, Mississippi. His killing has never been officially solved, and Emma was never charged in connection with it. By the time investigators in New Orleans returned to the Ernest Smith case with fresh leads, she had already moved on to a 4th husband, a man named John W. Golston, and had relocated to Missouri. The Smith case might have remained cold indefinitely. But around 2012 and 2013, relatives of James Rain came forward with information. They told police that a man named Alfred Everett, known as Terry, who was James's foster brother, had confessed to them that he had been the person who had killed Ernest Smith years earlier. He said he had been promised $10,000 out of the eventual insurance payout, and he had never been paid. That unpaid promise had, in his own telling, festered for years. Retired New Orleans Police Department Detective DeCinda Chambers took up the case and began building a prosecution that finally reached back to Emma. The gap between the killing in 2006 and the arrests years later meant that witnesses had to be re-interviewed. Financial records had to be pulled from long-closed accounts, and the state had to reconstruct a chain of events that had once looked untouchable. What does a jury see when the person on trial has already outlived 3 husbands? Alfred Everett was tried first. In December of 2014, he was convicted of second-degree murder in the killing of Ernest Smith and sentenced to life in prison. Emma stood trial next. On the 12th of August, 2016, a Louisiana jury convicted her of second-degree murder for orchestrating her husband's death. On the 21st of October, 2016, Judge Tracy Flemings de Villiers sentenced her to the state's mandatory life without the possibility of parole. Her attorney at the time, Martin Regan, indicated an intent to appeal. Her fourth husband, John Golston, publicly maintained her innocence throughout the trial and after her sentencing, insisting that the wife he knew was not capable of what a jury had just convicted her of doing. Prosecutors, for their part, argued that the pattern across her earlier marriages made the case against her all the more difficult to explain away as coincidence. Members of Ernest Smith's family, who had waited a decade for a verdict, gave statements describing what those years had cost them. As of 2026, Emma Rain continues to serve her sentence in a Louisiana correctional facility. Under Louisiana's mandatory life without parole statute for second-degree murder, she has no realistic path to release. The killings of her first and third husbands remain officially uncharged, and unless new evidence emerges, they are likely to stay that way. Where Rain's case leaned on decades of pattern and one man's late confession, the next case unfolded within a single year, and it involved a wife who tried to hide her husband in her own back garden. Maureen Rickards. In the summer of 2024, a woman in Canterbury, England, told her stepdaughter that her husband had left the country for work in Saudi Arabia. She continued to use his bank cards. She continued to live in their home. She told family that he had died by his own hand while abroad. But when a police officer finally arrived at the property, he noticed something in the air. And what officers eventually found in the back garden made clear that Jeremy Rickards had never left home at all. Jeremy Rickards was a geologist. He was 65 years old and had been married to Maureen for 27 years. Those who knew the couple would later describe a quiet man who had reasons to fear his wife. Prosecutors would eventually describe a marriage marked by years of abuse, with Maureen as the aggressor throughout. Maureen Rickards, born on the 10th of April 1974, lived with Jeremy at their home on St. Martin's Road in Canterbury, Kent. Their marriage had lasted decades on the surface. Behind closed doors, according to prosecutors and to the evidence introduced at trial, Maureen had been the abusive partner in the relationship. She had recorded herself, on more than one occasion, assaulting and threatening Jeremy. In one of those recordings, she is heard telling him that she would take his life that very night. Around the 9th of June, 2024, Jeremy Rickards was stabbed to death inside the couple's home. He suffered 5 wounds to the chest, and a post-mortem examination would later find that 2 of them had gone directly through his heart. The same examination would find evidence of an earlier strangulation and previous rib fractures, indicating that this had not been the first act of violence in the household. After his death, Maureen stored his body in a bedroom cupboard. She then wrapped the remains in bin bags and a hold-all and hid them in the back garden, covering the bags with grass cuttings. For nearly a month, Maureen went on with her life as if nothing had happened. She used her husband's bank cards to make purchases. She continued to live in their home. When family members grew concerned, she offered a series of explanations. She told them Jeremy had traveled to Saudi Arabia for a work assignment. Later, she claimed that he had died by his own hand while abroad. On the 5th of July, 2024, Jeremy's stepdaughter, unconvinced by the story, formally reported him missing to authorities. Police initially treated the matter as a fraud investigation, given the ongoing use of his cards. But an officer who visited the property noticed the distinct smell of decomposition. A neighbor had already reported an unpleasant odor coming from the garden. On the 11th of July, 2024, officers searching the back garden found Jeremy's body wrapped and hidden as described. The murder weapon itself was never recovered. An entomologist would later help investigators pinpoint the approximate time of death by examining the insect activity around the remains. a piece of forensic testimony that would prove important at trial. How does a prosecution proceed when the defendant refuses to acknowledge the case being made against her? On the 13th of March, 2025, Maureen Rickards was convicted of murder. Sources differ on the exact venue, with reporting variously citing Canterbury Crown Court and Maidstone Crown Court for portions of the proceedings. On the 9th of April, 2025, she was sentenced by Mr. Justice Kerr to life in prison with a minimum term of 22 years before she could apply for parole. She refused to attend her own sentencing hearing. She has never publicly acknowledged responsibility for Jeremy's death. Her remark to officers on the day of her arrest, when asked about the body in her garden, was a simple question. What body? That single phrase would follow her through every headline that reported on the verdict. The Crown Prosecution Service issued a public statement afterward describing Maureen's behavior in the weeks after Jeremy's death as callous and calculated. And prosecutors emphasized during the trial that the recording she had made of herself abusing Jeremy left little doubt about the nature of their marriage. Members of Jeremy's family, including the stepdaughter who had raised the alarm, gave impact statements describing a quiet man whose steadiness had been mistaken by his wife for weakness. As of 2026, Maureen Rickards continues to serve her sentence in a prison in England. She will not be eligible to apply for parole until she has served at least 22 years, meaning her earliest possible release would come no sooner than 2047, when she would be in her 70s. Even then, release would not be automatic. A UK parole board would have to determine that she no longer poses a risk before she could be considered for release, and given her refusal to acknowledge what she has done, that judgment may prove difficult. Rickards tried to hide her husband in her own garden. The next wife tried to hide hers across 2 states, packed inside 3 matching suitcases. Melanie Maguire. In May of 2004, 3 matching Kenneth Cole suitcases were pulled from the water near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel in Virginia. Inside each of them were parts of the same man. His name was William Maguire, a computer analyst from New Jersey who had just closed on a new home with his wife, a fertility clinic nurse named Melanie. She told police he had walked out after a fight. But by the time the 3rd suitcase washed ashore, investigators were looking closely at Melanie, and what they found would earn her a nickname that stuck. William Maguire, known to friends and family as Bill, was 39 years old and worked as a computer analyst at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He and Melanie had 2 young sons. On the day his life ended, the couple had just closed on a new home. To those around him, everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. Melanie Maguire, born Melanie Slate on the 8th of October, 1972, was a nurse at Reproductive Medicine Associates, a well-known fertility clinic in New Jersey. She had married Bill in 1999. What Bill did not know was that she was carrying on an affair with a doctor at the clinic named Bradley Miller. Prosecutors would later say that on the very night the couple had celebrated the closing of their new home, on the 28th of April, 2004, Melanie ended his life. According to the state's case, Melanie drugged Bill with chloral hydrate and then took his life with a small caliber handgun. Because young children were part of the household, prosecutors were careful in the years that followed about how they described what happened after his passing. What is a matter of court record is that his remains were placed inside 3 matching Kenneth Cole suitcases and driven south toward the Chesapeake Bay. Melanie then told police that Bill had attacked her and stormed out of the apartment, and she sought a restraining order against him. In the days that followed, his abandoned car was located in Atlantic City. And then, one after another, the suitcases began to appear. The first suitcase surfaced near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel on the 5th of May, 2004. The second appeared on the 11th. The third on the 16th. Investigators began building a case that would take more than a year to complete. They found that Melanie had purchased a .38 caliber handgun in Pennsylvania in the days before Bill's death. They found a vial of chloral hydrate and syringes inside his abandoned car in Atlantic City. Toll booth footage placed her driving in the direction of the location where the car was eventually found. They uncovered a forged prescription connected to her. And most damning of all, they recovered her computer search history. Someone using her computer had searched for information on how to commit murder, on undetectable poisons, and on chloral hydrate itself. DNA evidence connected cut hairs to Bill, along with a blanket linked to hospital linens. In June of 2005, Melanie was arrested. Can circumstantial evidence alone support a first-degree murder conviction when the defendant insists she had nothing to do with what happened? On the 19th of July, 2007, at the age of 34, Melanie McGuire was convicted of first-degree murder, along with a weapons offense, desecrating human remains, and perjury. During sentencing, Judge Frederick DeVesa described what she had done as something that shocked the conscience of his court. He handed down a sentence of life in prison plus 5 additional years. Under New Jersey law, she must serve roughly 66 years and 3 months before becoming eligible for parole, with a reported earliest date in the year 2073. The New Jersey Appellate Division affirmed her conviction on the 16th of March, 2011. The New Jersey Supreme Court denied certification on the 22nd of September, 2011. She filed for post-conviction relief in 2014 on grounds of ineffective assistance of counsel, which was denied. In more recent years, a podcast produced by 2 Fairleigh Dickinson University professors, Megan Sachs and Amy Schlossberg, called Direct Appeal, has raised questions about a ballistics discrepancy between the handgun Melanie had purchased and the bullets recovered. She continues to maintain her innocence. As of 2026, Melanie McGuire continues to serve her sentence at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Clinton, New Jersey. She now writes under her maiden name, Melanie Slate. After her arrest, custody of her 2 sons went to her late husband's sister, Cindy Ligosh, who has raised them into adulthood. McGuire's case turned on physical evidence found across state lines. The next case turned on what a wife did inside her own home on an ordinary afternoon. Julie Harper. In August of 2012, a popular high school math teacher in Carlsbad, California, was found lifeless in the upstairs bedroom of the home he shared with his wife and their 3 children. He was 39 years old, and only 5 days earlier, his wife had filed for divorce. She did not call for help. Instead, she buried the weapon where police would never find it and then vanished. When she turned herself in nearly a day later, she said she had acted in self-defense against years of abuse she had suffered in silence. Jason Harper was 39 years old and a math teacher at a Carlsbad high school. He was known for his patience with students and his warm presence in the classroom. He and his wife had 3 children together and lived as a family in Carlsbad. In the days leading up to his death, his marriage had reached a breaking point. Julie Harper had filed for divorce approximately 5 days before her husband lost his life. She would later allege that she had endured years of abuse and sexual assault by Jason during their marriage. Allegations that prosecutors would firmly dispute at trial. The couple's children were at home when the events of that afternoon unfolded, watching television on a lower floor while Julie and Jason were upstairs. On the 7th of August, 2012, Julie Harper took her husband's life inside the upstairs master bedroom of their Carlsbad home. She did not call emergency services. Instead, she took the firearm involved and buried it somewhere in the surrounding area, in a location that investigators were never able to identify or recover. Roughly 16 hours passed between the time Jason lost his life and the moment his body was discovered by police performing a welfare check on the family's home. Julie, in the meantime, had traveled to her father's home in the Scripps Ranch area of San Diego. She turned herself in there. Prosecutors would later reveal that she had prepared what they described as a getaway bag containing passports and cash, which they argued suggested planning rather than a spontaneous reaction to abuse. The investigation focused on the reconstruction of events inside the home. Because the weapon had been hidden and never recovered, prosecutors relied on forensic evidence at the scene and on the timeline of Julie's behavior in the hours after her husband's passing. Her failure to call for help, her decision to leave the home, and the presence of a prepared bag with travel documents all became central to the state's case. The defense, in turn, argued that Julie had acted out of fear for her life after enduring years of abuse she had never reported. They pointed to what they described as a long pattern of coercion within the marriage that had made her fear for her safety. The trial would come down to whether a jury believed Julie had acted to escape her husband or to be rid of him permanently. How does a jury draw the line between self-defense and premeditation when the person accused says she had no other choice? Julie Harper's first trial, in 2014, ended in a partial victory for the defense. The jury acquitted her of first-degree murder, but deadlocked on the lesser charges, resulting in a mistrial. In her retrial in 2015, a second jury convicted her of second-degree murder, along with a firearm enhancement. In January of 2016, Judge Blaine Bowman sentenced her to a combined term of 40 years to life. That sentence consisted of 15 years to life on the underlying charge and 25 years to life for the firearm enhancement, the two terms to run consecutively. During sentencing, Judge Bowman remarked that Julie's actions had left her children without either parent, and that the choices she had made in the hours after her husband's death were difficult to reconcile with the account of self-defense her lawyers had put forward. Requests to strike the 25-year gun enhancement were denied in 2018 and again in March of 2023, when the court resentenced her to the same combined term. Her direct appeal did not disturb the underlying conviction, and subsequent post-conviction efforts have not altered the outcome. As of 2026, Julie Harper continues to serve her sentence at the California Institution for Women in Chino. Her earliest reported parole eligibility date sits around 2039. While awaiting her retrial, Julie became pregnant through in vitro fertilization. That daughter is being raised by Julie's father, who has become a full-time caretaker for her, along with the couple's other 3 children, all of whom were placed in his care after the events of 2012. Harper's case ended with a partial defense victory, and then a full conviction. The final case on this list ended with a jury persuaded that a wife had orchestrated her husband's death from a distance, using another man as her instrument. Monica Cementilli. In January of 2017, a world-renowned celebrity hairdresser lost his life on the back patio of his Woodland Hills home while smoking a cigar. His name was Fabio Cementilli, and to the outside world, he had everything. A thriving career, a family, a marriage of roughly 20 years. His wife told police the killing had to have been a botched robbery. But by the time investigators had pulled the surveillance footage, the emails, and the jailhouse recordings, they had built a case that painted Monica Cementilli not as a grieving widow, but as its architect. Fabio Cementilli was 49 years old. He was a hairdresser and a beauty industry executive whose client list had reportedly included some of the most recognizable names in entertainment. He and Monica had been married for roughly 2 decades and had 2 daughters together. They lived in Woodland Hills, in the Los Angeles area, in a home that from the outside looked like a picture of family stability. For roughly 18 months before her husband's death, Monica Sementilli had been carrying on an affair with a man named Robert Louis Baker, a racquetball coach with a criminal history that included a prior conviction as a sex offender. Prosecutors would later say that the 2 of them had conspired to end Fabio's life so that Monica could collect on his $1.6 million life insurance policy and continue her relationship with Baker without interference. Their communications, prosecutors argued, laid out a plan that had been developed carefully in the weeks leading up to the killing. On the 23rd of January, 2017, Baker took Fabio's life on the back patio of the Sementilli home. Fabio had been sitting outdoors smoking a cigar. His younger daughter would be the one to make the discovery later that evening. His older daughter had been elsewhere at the time, away from the home. Baker then fled the scene in Fabio's Porsche, which was later found abandoned nearby. The case was initially treated as a botched robbery attempt, which was consistent with the account Monica had given police. Very little about that first impression would survive. DNA evidence collected at the scene led investigators to Robert Baker. Once Baker was identified, the affair with Monica surfaced quickly. Prosecutors said Monica had sent Baker emails containing detailed instructions on how to access the home's surveillance system, along with a timeline of when Fabio would be alone that day. Those emails, read into evidence at trial, became a central piece of the state's case. A third participant, a former probation officer named Christopher Austin, was arrested in Washington state in 2024, extradited to California, and pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 years in exchange for his testimony against Monica, and his cooperation gave prosecutors an inside witness they had lacked for years. Monica and Baker had been arrested together back on the 14th of June, 2017. Jailhouse recordings and letters exchanged in the years that followed documented that their relationship had continued behind bars, and prosecutors used those exchanges to undercut any argument that Monica had been distant from what Baker had done. What does a jury make of a wife whose alleged accomplice, from prison, insists she had nothing to do with the plan? Robert Baker pleaded no contest in July of 2023 to first-degree murder, along with special circumstances of financial gain and lying in wait. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. From prison, he later attempted to distance Monica from responsibility, insisting that she had not been involved in planning what he had done. Prosecutors and the trial court both treated that reversal with skepticism, framing it as the kind of statement a co-defendant sometimes makes once his own sentence is set. Monica's own trial ran for approximately 10 weeks. On the 11th of April, 2025, a Los Angeles jury convicted her of first-degree murder with the same special circumstances of financial gain and lying in wait, along with conspiracy. On the 23rd of June, 2025, Judge Ronald S. Cohen delivered the sentence. He described Monica as the mastermind of what had happened, saying that Baker did not have the intelligence to have planned so carefully thought out a crime on his own. He called her the prime mover of the entire scheme. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Members of Fabio Sementilli's family spoke at sentencing and described the woman they had once considered part of the family in terms very different from anything they had said in the days after his death. As of 2026, Monica Sementilli is incarcerated in a California correctional facility. Robert Baker is also serving life without parole. Christopher Austin is serving his 15-year sentence under the terms of his plea agreement. No appeal from Monica had been publicly reported as of the most recent available coverage, though her sentence, imposed only months before this list was compiled, remains within the window when a direct appeal would typically still be pending. That's 10 cases and 10 wives. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.